Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about code complexity. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how do you control code complexity as your application grows? I try to modularize my code and I try to structure each segment of the system in what I call well, it is a module, but I try to centralize that which is coupled. Let me explain that a little bit. So I've made a few videos about this, and the best way I can describe it is if you imagine how you depend on various packages, like open source packages, doesn't matter which platform you're on, right? When you install a package, what you're in essence doing is that you're pulling down a folder, like a tarball or like a zip file or something like that, but you're basically pulling in somebody else's code and plugging it into your system in some way. And the way that each of those packages is structured is just a folder or a module, if you want to think about it that way. And that module exposes all the things that you need in terms of value from whatever library you're using to hook into your own code. Now, the biggest mistake I see quite a lot of software developers do, and the two extremes are usually either you build a monolith or you go microservices. And in my opinion, the best basic strategy that works, I've never seen it fail really, because when you have people when people are making a module like a monolith, what they usually do, in my opinion, is that they put the level of abstraction or like this architecture of their system as one package. In other words, you build a system and you do exactly the thing as I was saying. You create like some type of root folder with a source and some tests and stuff like that, and then everything goes into that gigantic package. And as your system grows, you just continue growing it. So if you wanted to ship this thing as something, it becomes one single gigantic unit. However, then you have the other people that say, all right, we should not build monoliths. We should go microservices because that is more modular basically. So what they do instead is that they basically slice up all of these, like this gigantic monolith, into small packages or small modules, and then they put them in a different service somewhere with databases and stuff like that, right? And so now you have a different problem, because basically what you have done is that you have moved to a distributed system, which is also a complicated affair. There's some trade-offs there because you have now synchronization between services, you have network, you have extra cost, and all of these other things that come into play when you have multiple services talking over a network. What I like to say is that start with a modularized monolith. In other words, if you don't have a need for microservices and all the extra complexity that comes with it, understand that the idea behind a microservice is just to take an arbitrary domain area within your system, basically let's say users or products or customers or something like that, it doesn't matter what it is, right? And basically create an API for all the endpoints that is associated with that entity or that area of your system and put it in a service. And all I'd say is, don't put it into a service, put it into a folder in the same monolith. That's it. So in theory, if you wanted to move that to a microservice, all you would have to do is to basically copy paste the entry point, like the server that is starting this monolith, and if you've done it correctly, then there should be a controller or some network interface that is exposing all the endpoints from that module, from that folder, that is just being hooked in. It's a bit like a kernel pattern. You can look into that. That's how a kernel usually works. You have different modules and you have a loader that loads each of these modules in sequence, and that's exactly what I tell people to do. Expose the controller with the endpoints from that module, and then it's literally a one-liner in the main file that starts up the monolith. And so if you wanted to make that into a microservice, all you would need to do is to copy paste that folder and the server start file into another repo, and remove all the others, like in all the other controllers that are being hooked in based from the other parts of the system, and you would have a microservice. If you have done that, then that folder includes all the code that it needs in order to do whatever it does. That is extremely scalable. And if you think about it, it's basically how the entire open source industry works that way, or like everything in open source is exactly that thing. It's just a gigantic, like whatever package manager you're using, it's just a gigantic repository of different packages. Some of them depend on other packages, and that is, of course, also something you need to consider. I usually try to do this in like a standard project for myself or for my teams or so forth, if they're open to trying it out. Basically what I do is say, all right, you have a source folder, here are all the modules. If a module is not a leaf, in other words, it does not have, like it is a dependent, more than one other part of the, like the source folder with all the other modules, at least two modules is depending on it, put it into a shared folder. Because what basically happens then, if there is a shared folder plus, which then contains this module, right, plus all the other like all the other leaves, which are just usually like folders that expose a controller somewhere with some endpoints. That's usually like the leaf of your entire thing, right? Then your dependency graph becomes fairly easy to maintain, because then everything that is in the shared folder is a dependency of something outside of the shared folder, but you don't have this interconnection weirdness that happens if you don't know how to structure your monolith, where you get a spider web of different dependencies between the different modules, and it becomes hard for you to figure out how the graph actually works. So in that scenario, basically all you need to figure out again is, okay, so either something is shared, and therefore it's going to be a dependency to one of the leaf things, or it's a leaf. It's just a controller somewhere, like with some services, depending on how you set it up, of course, that is just exposing an interface that is hooking into the server itself. That dependency graph becomes very easy to manage, and then in our little scenario here, if you wanted to make that into a separate service, well, then you need two folders. You need one folder, like the folder that houses all the endpoints that you're trying to move to a microservice or something like that, or whatever you're making. And you need the shared folder if it is sharing any dependencies with the shared folder. And even if you do a split in that scenario, it's pretty easy for you to just publish those shared modules, because maybe you split some parts of this system up into a separate service in the future, because you've grown to that point where a single monolith is no longer sustainable for you, and you want to start doing some microservices, but maybe some of it is going to stay in the monolith. You become very flexible like this, because basically all you have to do is to copy out the folders that have exposes the interfaces, put that into another system, and then the shared folder might have some stuff that is needed in that microservice and some stuff that is needed in the monolith. All you have to do is to publish those folders, or like those packages, as as an external package, as just a dependencies that you pull in, like any package you would pull in from whatever package management system that you need. And that way you make it very easy to scale complexity over a really, really, really long time, at least in my experience. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I control code complexity as my application grows is by thinking in terms of modules, where instead of just having one gigantic monolith where you have your classic one, you have your models, your services, your repo folders, or what have you, and like everything is just one gigantic package where like all the code is sort of living in one big pile together. I try to separate things into domain areas. In other words, you have areas such as the basics of domain-driven design. You have your users, your products, your emails, or whatever. You create folders for the various entities within your system, and then you put all code that is directly coupled to that. It becomes basically encapsulation. As you know, when we do object-oriented programming, we try to encapsulate everything that is necessary within a class into a private interface and only expose that which is necessary for a consumer, to the public stuff basically that you should be interacting with. And if you are doing that correctly in a standard web application, then quote unquote the only thing that would be exposed from those modules would be the controller, because that's the only thing that is going to hook into the server, and then everything else comes, the request comes in over the network, right? And then when it turns out that you might have some logic in that module that is actually not only strictly for that module anymore, then you lift it up, put it into a shared folder, and you name that new service folder that you created, which is just some shared code, which is usually not a controller. It's just a service, a database interface, call it whatever you want, a pure function, a utility function, something like that. You put that in the shared structure. And then that basically means that you now have a way to control the state of your monolith, so it doesn't become like all spaghetti. It becomes fairly easy to scale over time. And if it turns out that you really need to make a microservice, or you need to move some parts of the system out of this monolith, it is as easy as copy pasting one of, or the folders that you need with the API endpoints that you need, and just look, does it depend on anything in the shared folder? Okay, some of it, those things now go and become, if they can go with, like if they're not used by anything that is remaining, that's great, then you can just copy paste those things over as well. But if it is shared both in the monolith, or like this modular monolith, and in this new microservice you're creating, then just publish it as a package. That works really well. And for the people in front end, the logic is basically the same for you. It's just that you're using visual components. You create folders with visual components, and everything that is tied into that component lives in that specific folder. And if something is shared, you put it in a shared structure, and you try to keep things in that structured in that fashion. The basic pattern is a kernel pattern. If you want to look it up, it's a pattern that works extremely well, I would say. And I am sad to say that it is not as established to do this as MVC, for example. I think that the software industry would do really well if we could get to a point where that also it becomes as established as unit testing or MVC, or some one of these like sort of golden rules we almost always try to follow. Have a great day.